Tonight, we will tell you a story not of heroes or ancient cities, but of a common human experience that, for centuries, was a source of profound fear and agonizing pain, the medieval toothache. You will learn why a visit to the dentist was often more terrifying than the pain itself, and how people tried to find relief in a world without modern medicine. We will explore the strange beliefs about what caused dental problems, who dared to perform extractions, and the brutal methods used to alleviate suffering. You will hear about the surprising individuals who took on this grim task, the desperate remedies they offered, and the stark reality of life when a simple toothache could lead to a slow, agonizing end. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, remember to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with topics you would like to hear about. New sleep stories are released every day. All right, find a comfortable spot, perhaps dim the lights, and let your mind drift back to a time when health was a mystery and pain was a constant companion. Our journey begins not in a grand castle, but in the harsh reality of everyday life in the Middle Ages, where the human body was a riddle and its ailments a curse. The story of medieval dentistry is not merely a tale of tooth extraction. It is a window into a world where life itself was often harsh, brief, and fraught with constant daily pain. To truly understand the fear that a visit to a medieval dentist would inspire, you must first comprehend the broader context of health and medicine in that distant era. Imagine a time when the very concept of disease was fundamentally different from our modern understanding, when the human body was a deep mystery and relief from suffering was a rarity. Life in the Middle Ages, generally spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was characterized by an omnipresent struggle for survival. For the vast majority of people, existence was defined by physical labor, often from dawn till dusk. Peasants toiled in the fields, knights trained for combat, and artisans worked with their hands. This constant exertion, combined with a diet that was often nutritionally inadequate, took a significant toll on the human body over years of relentless labor. While local variations existed, the staple diet for most was heavy in grains. Bread, porridge, and gruel were common, providing sustenance but often lacking the variety of vitamins and minerals necessary for robust health. Meat was a luxury for many, and fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal, often scarce, or difficult to preserve. This limited diet, combined with the absence of refrigeration, meant that food spoilage was a constant risk, contributing to digestive ailments and general weakness. Beyond diet, sanitation was rudimentary, almost non-existent by today's standards. Towns and cities, though much smaller than modern metropolises, were often crowded and unsanitary. Waste disposal was a significant challenge, leading to the accumulation of refuse in streets and waterways. Clean drinking water was not readily available to everyone, and contaminated sources were a common vector for diseases. Epidemics, such as the devastating Black Death in the 14th century, swept across continents with terrifying speed and lethality, underscoring the precariousness of life and the fragility of public health. Even common illnesses, which we now treat with simple medications, could be fatal. A fever, a persistent cough, or a minor wound could quickly escalate into a life-threatening condition due to the lack of effective treatments and the ever-present threat of infection. The average life expectancy was remarkably low, often hovering around 30 to 40 years, though this figure is skewed by high infant mortality rates. Those who survived childhood often lived longer, but their lives were frequently marked by chronic ailments and physical decline. The medical understanding of the era was rooted in ancient theories rather than empirical observation. The prevailing medical philosophy was derived largely from the writings of Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, whose works were transmitted and translated through Arab scholars. The most influential of these was the theory of the four humors. This belief held that the human body contained four primary fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to arise from an imbalance of these humors. For instance, an excess of blood might lead to fever, while too much black bile could cause melancholy. Treatments, therefore, focused on restoring this balance, often through practices like bloodletting, purging, or inducing vomiting. While these methods sometimes provided temporary relief, they were often ineffective and occasionally harmful, particularly when performed without proper understanding of anatomy or hygiene. Anatomy itself was poorly understood. Human dissection was rare and often prohibited for religious or social reasons, meaning that much of the knowledge of the body's internal workings was extrapolated from animal dissections, which were not always accurate for human physiology. The concept of germs or microorganisms as a cause of disease was completely unknown. Infections were often attributed to bad air, divine punishment, or an imbalance of humors. This lack of fundamental scientific understanding meant that medical interventions were largely based on observation of symptoms, traditional remedies, and a significant degree of guesswork. Within this broader context of precarious health, dental pain was an almost universal affliction. The diet, as mentioned, was often coarse and abrasive. Grains, the dietary cornerstone, were frequently ground in stone mills, meaning that small particles of grit and stone often found their way into bread. This abrasive material, when chewed, would wear down tooth enamel over time, creating fissures and vulnerabilities. Sugary foods, while not as prevalent for the general population as they would become in later centuries, were still consumed in forms like honey and fruits, contributing to decay when combined with poor oral hygiene. The idea of brushing one's teeth daily or even regularly was not a common practice. People might rinse their mouths with water, or occasionally chew on certain herbs to freshen breath, but systematic cleaning was absent. Food particles would remain trapped between teeth, leading to the accumulation of plaque and the proliferation of bacteria. This created an ideal environment for tooth decay, which, once it began, would progress unchecked. A small cavity could quickly become a deep infection, reaching the sensitive pulp within the tooth, causing agonizing pain. This pain was not merely a discomfort. It was often debilitating, preventing individuals from eating, sleeping, or working. It could spread to the jaw, the face, and even lead to dangerous abscesses, truly threatening life itself. Therefore, for the medieval person, a toothache was not a minor inconvenience to be resolved with a quick visit to a modern dentist. It was a severe, often chronic, and deeply feared torment. It was a common, almost inevitable part of life, a persistent companion for many, especially as they aged. The inability to chew properly led to further nutritional deficiencies, creating a vicious cycle of poor health. The suffering was immense, and the desperation for relief was truly profound. driving people to seek help from anyone who claimed to possess the knowledge or skill to alleviate their agony, no matter how unconventional or frightening their methods might be. This widespread and intense dental suffering set the stage for the crude, often terrifying practices that passed for dentistry in the Middle Ages, when the relentless throb of a toothache became utterly unbearable in the medieval world. You could not simply visit a trained dental professional, as you might today. The concept of a specialized dentist, educated in the intricate anatomy of the oral cavity and the specific pathologies that afflicted teeth and gums, simply did not exist. There were no universities offering degrees in dentistry, no formalized training programs, and no professional bodies to regulate practice or ensure patient safety. Instead, if you were fortunate enough to seek any kind of intervention, you would turn to individuals whose primary professions lay far afield from medicine, yet who possessed either the necessary tools, the perceived manual skill, or simply the audacious willingness to perform such a brutal and often dangerous task. The very thought of undergoing such a procedure performed by untrained hands in unsterile, often dimly lit environments was often as terrifying as the excruciating, relentless pain itself. One of the most common figures to undertake dental work, particularly extractions, was the barber, known then as a barber surgeon. These men were far more than just stylists who trimmed beards and cut hair. Their trade often extended to a wide range of minor surgical procedures. You would find them performing bloodletting, a common medieval medical practice believed to rebalance the body's humors, lancing boils, setting simple fractures, and, crucially, pulling teeth. Their shops, often modest and bustling, were identifiable by the distinctive red and white striped pole outside, a symbol that alluded to the blood and bandages of their dual profession. Inside, the air might carry the metallic tang of blood, the faint scent of herbal concoctions, and the sharp aroma of soap. The barber possessed a variety of sharp instruments, razors, lancets, and a collection of pincers or forceps, some of which were specifically designed for gripping and extracting objects, including teeth. While their hands might be steady from years of precise cutting, their understanding of the human mouth, its delicate nerves, and the potential for infection was rudimentary at best. They learned their craft through practical apprenticeship, observing and assisting a master, rather than from academic texts on anatomy or physiology. Their methods were necessarily rough, driven by the immediate goal of removing the visible source of pain, often with little regard for sterility or the long-term consequences of such an aggressive intervention. The process was swift and brutal, relying on force and speed to overcome the patient's resistance and the tooth's stubborn grip. You would likely be seated on a simple stool, perhaps held firmly by an assistant, as the barber, with grim determination, applied his tools. Beyond the barber, another surprising and truly formidable figure sometimes took on the role of tooth extractor, the local blacksmith. Imagine the scene. A man whose days were spent forging metal, hammering iron into shape, and bending powerful tools, now turning his large, strong, and often calloused hands and formidable collection of pliers and tongs to a delicate, inflamed tooth. Blacksmiths were renowned for their immense physical strength and their practical ability to wield powerful implements with precision and force. When a tooth was deeply rooted, perhaps broken or impacted, and stubbornly refused to yield to a barber's less robust instruments, the raw, unadulterated power of the blacksmith might be seen as the only viable solution. Their workshops, known as forges, were certainly not places of sterile calm. They were environments of intense heat, rhythmic clang, and the pervasive smell of coal smoke and hot metal. The floor would be dirt or rough stone, often littered with scraps of iron and tools. The extraction itself would be a terrifying test of brute force, with the patient likely held down by strong assistants or even apprentices, enduring unimaginable pain and the truly alarming sight of tools designed for shaping solid iron, now approaching their mouth. The sound of the extraction, a sickening crack or tear, would echo in the noisy confines of the forge, a stark testament to the violence of the procedure. There was no anesthetic, save perhaps a swig of rough ale or a prayer. Then there were the itinerants, the traveling charlatans and mountebanks who moved from town to town, village to village, often setting up their temporary clinics in bustling public squares, at vibrant market days, or even outside local fairs. These were the true showmen of medieval dentistry, self-proclaimed doctors or tooth drawers, who promised instant cures and miraculous relief from all manner of ailments, including the most stubborn and agonizing toothaches. They were masters of persuasion, often drawing large crowds with theatrical displays, loud proclamations of their unique abilities, and sometimes even the distraction of musical accompaniment or the antics of a jester. Dressed in flamboyant, often brightly colored clothes, perhaps with a top hat or an extravagant cloak, they would stand on a makeshift stage or wagon holding up a jar filled with tooth worms that they claimed to have just extracted, often using sleight of hand to fool the gullible. Their treatments were a deceptive mix of dubious elixirs, ineffective charms, and, when all else failed, the same brutal extractions as the barbers and blacksmiths, though often performed with even less care, hygiene, or genuine concern for the patient's well-being. These charlatans relied entirely on the desperation of the suffering, their own theatrical flair, and their ability to quickly pack up and disappear before their many failures caught up with them. They lacked any semblance of formal training, any legitimate medical knowledge, and operated purely on the fringes of society, exploiting fear, pain, and ignorance for profit. Their promises were grand, their methods crude, and their results often disastrous. In essence, dental care in the Middle Ages was a fragmented, entirely unregulated, and profoundly terrifying affair. There was no standardized curriculum, no professional body overseeing practices, and certainly no concept of pain-free or hygienic procedures. The individuals who undertook these tasks, whether they were the relatively respectable local barber, the powerfully imposing blacksmith, or the deceptive transient charlatan, did so without a deep understanding of infection, the intricate network of nerve endings, or the long-term implications for oral health. Their primary, indeed their sole aim, was simply to alleviate immediate suffering, almost always by removing the offending tooth, and the risks associated with such interventions were extraordinarily high. The hands that reached into your mouth might be those that had just handled dirty tools, or brewed questionable potions, or even sharpened swords. This fundamental lack of specialized knowledge, coupled with an utter disregard for sterile practice, made any encounter with medieval dentistry a harrowing experience, fraught with danger and often leading to further more severe complications rather than true, lasting relief. The very act of seeking help for a toothache was an act of profound courage, or perhaps simply an act of absolute agonizing desperation, driven by pain so intense that any risk seemed preferable to enduring it for another moment. But even the most experienced barber surgeons, the strongest blacksmiths, or the most convincing charlatans of the age shared a fundamental misunderstanding about the very nature of tooth decay. For centuries, across various cultures and civilizations, from ancient Babylon to the medieval West, a persistent and deeply ingrained belief held sway. Toothache was caused by a tiny, insidious creature, a tooth worm, burrowing within the afflicted tooth. This ancient notion, predating even the classical Greek philosophers, found fertile ground in the medieval world, where scientific inquiry was often intertwined with folklore and religious doctrine, and where the microscopic world remained entirely unseen and unimagined. The concept of the toothworm offered a simple, tangible explanation for a complex and agonizing condition, providing a seemingly logical cause for an otherwise mysterious and terribly debilitating pain. The idea was simple, yet terrifyingly vivid. An unseen worm, sometimes described as small and white, sometimes as black and gnawing, lived inside the tooth. It was believed to bore holes, consume the substance of the tooth, and its movements were thought to be the direct cause of the excruciating, throbbing pain that could incapacitate a person for days or weeks. When you experienced a sharp, sudden pang, a piercing jab that seemed to originate from deep within the bone, it was the worm biting, digging deeper into the nerve. When the pain was a dull, continuous ache, a relentless pressure behind the jaw, it was the worm slowly devouring, steadily working its way through the tooth's core. This internal, unseen enemy was particularly frightening precisely because it was hidden, making it difficult to target and even harder to understand. The worm theory provided a narrative, a villain, for a suffering that felt utterly inexplicable to those who endured it. The visual evidence seemed, to the medieval mind, to irrefutably support this theory. When a tooth became decayed, a visible hole, often dark and irregular, frequently appeared. To the medieval observer, lacking any knowledge of bacteria, sugar's effect on enamel, or the process of acid erosion, this cavity could only be explained as the meticulous, destructive work of a living, active entity. The intense, localized pain, often radiating through the jaw and even up into the temple, further cemented the idea that something was actively moving and gnawing within the tooth's core, irritating the sensitive tissues. Moreover, sometimes, if a severely decayed tooth was broken open, or if a collection of pus was drained from an abscess, tiny, white, rice-like fragments might be observed. These were almost certainly calcified pulp stones, food debris, or even fragments of the tooth itself. But to the anxious and unscientific observer, desperate for an explanation and relief, they were presented and accepted as irrefutable proof of the worm's existence, the actual physical manifestation of the tormentor that had been extracted. The charlatans, in particular, were adept at exploiting this belief, often secretly introducing small pieces of cheese or similar white matter into the patient's mouth, then triumphantly displaying them as the expelled worms, thus cementing their reputation and securing their fee. This pervasive belief in the toothworm profoundly shaped the approach to dental treatment. Removing decay or filling a cavity were concepts largely unknown or impractical with the available tools. Consequently, the primary goal was entirely focused on expelling, killing, or somehow pacifying this invisible tormentor. Diagnosis often involved not only a visual inspection of the afflicted tooth, but also a detailed interrogation of the patient's description of the pain, which was then interpreted through the lens of the worm's presumed activity. A skilled practitioner, or more often, a cunning trickster, might even claim to see the worm, perhaps through a magnifying glass, or to possess a secret method for drawing it out. Treatments, therefore, were largely designed around this worm theory. Many methods involved attempting to smoke the worm out of its lair, using a technique known as fumigation. Patients might be instructed to inhale the fumes of various burning substances, often highly toxic or narcotic herbs, through a funnel directed at the painful tooth. Henbane seeds were a particularly popular choice for this purpose. When these dark, tiny seeds were burned on a hot iron or coal, they produced a thick, acrid smoke and, crucially, would often crackle and release tiny, white, irregular fragments. These fragments, once cooled, could then be presented to the suffering patient as the expelled worms, a tangible sign of the treatment's success. This was a common and seemingly logical approach, as smoke was thought to penetrate the tooth and drive out the pest. However, the true efficacy of henbane smoke lay in its potent narcotic properties. Henbane contains alkaloids such as scopolamine and hyoscyamine, which are powerful sedatives and analgesics. Its primary effect was to dull the pain, induce a state of altered consciousness, and create a strong placebo effect, leading the patient to believe, given the widespread belief in the toothworm, it is perhaps no surprise that many initial attempts to alleviate dental pain were not physical manipulations, but rather deeply spiritual or entirely superstitious in their nature. In a time when the true causes of disease were unknown and medical science, as we understand it, was yet to develop, people often sought answers and remedies in the unseen world. They believed that unseen forces, perhaps even malevolent spirits or a curse, were at play in their suffering. They reasoned that if a minute invisible worm was relentlessly gnawing at the tooth, then perhaps a charm, a specific ritual, or a fervent appeal to higher powers could either drive it away, appease its destructive intent, or at the very least offer some form of mystical protection against its relentless attack. Often, this involved the elaborate use of amulets. These were not mere decorative trinkets. They were objects carefully chosen for their perceived magical or protective qualities, believed to be inherently imbued with a special, often mysterious power. You might encounter someone wearing a dried mole's foot around their neck, under the earnest belief that its profound association with the earth would somehow draw the pain away from the affected tooth and into the ground itself. Another common, though unsettling practice, involved carrying a tooth from a deceased person. It was thought that the cold, lifeless essence of such a macabre relic would somehow quiet the throbbing, fiery ache in a living mouth, a chilling and desperate mirroring of the problem. Sometimes, fragments of wood taken from a gallows were carried, or even a peculiar stone found within the stomach of a toad. Each item selected for its unusual, often dark origin or its association with death and the supernatural, all hoped to ward off the agonizing pain. A significant portion of these non-invasive remedies involved intricate written charms or devout prayers. A person suffering from intense and debilitating toothache might have a specific prayer, a verse carefully extracted from a holy text, or even a series of seemingly nonsensical words, which were nevertheless believed to hold potent magical properties, inscribed onto a small piece of parchment or fine cloth. This carefully prepared slip would then be folded with immense care, often placed into a tiny pouch made of leather or linen, and then worn continuously, suspended around the neck or tied directly to the jaw that was experiencing the relentless pain. This was seen as a constant silent plea for relief, a tangible, physical link to the mystical forces invoked by the written word. Such charms were often combined with specific times for their creation or application, such as during a full moon or precisely at dawn, to maximize their perceived efficacy according to prevailing astrological or deeply ingrained folk beliefs. More elaborate and often bizarre rituals also emerged from this potent blend of desperation and deep-seated superstition. Imagine someone truly at their wits' end from the ceaseless, tormenting throbbing, being advised to perform truly strange acts. For instance, a common belief suggested that spitting directly into the mouth of a living frog would magically transfer the pain to the amphibian, thereby miraculously freeing the human sufferer from their agony. Other rituals involved touching a specific type of tree, such as an oak or an ash, precisely at midnight while reciting a secret incantation or diligently collecting dew from a graveyard on a particular morning before sunrise, then using it to wash the aching jaw. These were not casual, fleeting acts. They were performed with a solemn, often fearful and profound hope, deeply rooted in a medieval worldview, where the visible world was constantly and profoundly influenced by an invisible realm of spirits, omens, and hidden, powerful connections. The underlying principle was often sympathetic magic, the ancient idea that like affects like, or that a specific action could profoundly influence a seemingly unrelated outcome. For those with a more profound and unwavering Christian faith, appealing directly to specific saints was a powerful and often preferred recourse, offering a spiritual path to relief. Saint Apollonia, in particular, gained immense prominence as the revered patron saint of dentistry and all those grievously afflicted by toothache. The legend surrounding her martyrdom held a powerful resonance and offered a direct connection to suffering. During her persecution, her tormentors were said to have brutally pulled out all of her teeth. This horrific act made her an incredibly sympathetic figure for anyone enduring dental pain, a direct intercessor who understood their suffering intimately and could advocate on their behalf. Consequently, devout individuals would pray fervently to her, light candles in her honor in churches, or even carry small effigies, medallions, or even purported relics associated with her. These acts were performed with genuine conviction and desperate hope, seeking divine intercession and miraculous relief from the relentless agony that no earthly physician or barber surgeon seemed capable of alleviating. The logic, from the perspective of the medieval mind, was often quite clear, even if it completely defies modern scientific understanding. If the cause of suffering was mysterious, unseen, and perhaps even supernatural in its origin, then the cure might also need to be equally mysterious, lying far beyond the crude realm of physical manipulation or simple material remedies. These practices offered not a guaranteed cure, which was rarely found, but a profound form of psychological comfort, a vital sense of agency in the face of overwhelming helplessness. They provided a ritual, a tangible action to perform, a glimmer of hope, and the comforting belief that one was actively doing something, anything, against an overwhelming, inexplicable foe that could steal sleep, appetite, and peace of mind. They were, in essence, a testament to the human spirit's desperate need for control and meaning when faced with uncontrollable and relentless pain. While these deeply spiritual and superstitious remedies offered a measure of psychological solace and perhaps a fleeting sense of hope, they very rarely provided any true, lasting physical relief from the underlying dental condition. The imagined tooth worm, or the very real decay it represented, continued its insidious work, and the painful progression of the ailment continued unabated. As the initial comfort faded, and the toothache persisted or even intensified its torment, people often found themselves compelled to turn to more tangible, though still rudimentary and often dangerous, forms of treatment. The next crucial step in their desperate, unending search for relief would often lead them into the world of herbal remedies and various poultices, which offered a different, yet equally uncertain path towards alleviating their suffering, perhaps with more direct, albeit limited, physical intervention. From the realm of the purely mystical, those suffering from the relentless throbbing of a toothache often turned to the earth itself, seeking solace in the vast pharmacopoeia of nature. This marked a shift towards more tangible, though largely ineffective, methods. It was believed that if a charm failed, perhaps a plant, with its inherent power, could succeed where incantations could not. This approach, while herbal poultices and various concoctions offered some measure of fleeting relief, there were times when the relentless throbbing of a deeply infected tooth transcended mere discomfort, escalating into an unbearable torment that demanded more potent intervention. In an age devoid of modern anesthetics, medieval practitioners, whether they were barbers, blacksmiths, or the occasional wandering charlatan, turned to substances that, while powerful, carried their own profound risks. Their goal was not to cure, but simply to dull the raw, agonizing edge of pain, to quiet the screams that echoed from the very core of a sufferer's being. One of the most formidable and widely recognized pain-relieving agents available was opium. Derived from the milky sap of the opium poppy, a plant known since ancient times for its narcotic properties, this substance was a double-edged sword. It could bring blissful oblivion, but also insidious addiction and, in uncontrolled doses, death. Medieval apothecaries and even some more knowledgeable healers understood its power. Opium was often prepared as laudanum, an alcoholic tincture, or simply mixed with wine or other liquids and ingested. For dental pain, a small piece of the raw opium paste might even be placed directly into a tooth cavity or rubbed onto the swollen gum. The effect was profound, a wave of warmth, a slowing of the heart, and a merciful detachment from the world of pain. The aching tooth, for a time, would cease its relentless assault, allowing the sufferer a few precious hours of respite, or perhaps even a deep, dreamless sleep. However, the exact dosage was a matter of guesswork and observation, not precise measurement, making each administration a perilous gamble. Too little, and the pain persisted. Too much, and the patient might never awaken. Even more mysterious and fraught with danger was the mandrake plant. Its gnarled roots, sometimes resembling tiny human figures, gave rise to a host of superstitions and myths, including the belief that it shrieked when pulled from the earth. But beyond the folklore, mandrake possessed genuinely potent narcotic and hallucinogenic properties. It was considered a powerful sedative, capable of inducing a deep, almost death-like sleep, making it a rare and desperate choice for preparing a patient for a painful procedure like a tooth extraction. The roots were often boiled in wine to create a strong decoction, or a soporific sponge could be soaked in the liquid and placed over the patient's nostrils to induce unconsciousness through inhalation. The problem, as with opium, lay in the unpredictable strength of the plant and the lack of precise dosage. Mandrake is highly toxic. A slight miscalculation could easily lead to respiratory failure, coma, or a fatal cardiac arrest. The line between rendering a patient insensible to pain and rendering them lifeless was incredibly fine, making its use a testament to the sheer desperation of those seeking relief. More commonly, and perhaps less perilously, though still far from an ideal solution, was the liberal use of alcohol. Strong wines, potent ales, or distilled spirits, where available, were consumed in large quantities. The goal was simple: to numb the senses through sheer intoxication. A patient might be given cup after cup, their mind becoming foggy and their perceptions dulled until the pain of the toothache, while still present, was drowned out by the overwhelming effects of the alcohol. Sometimes a cloth soaked in strong alcohol might be applied directly to the affected area, though this offered little more than a temporary stinging sensation followed by minor surface numbness. While alcohol did not carry the same immediate fatal risk as a potent dose of opium or mandrake, its effects were fleeting, and it did nothing to address the underlying infection. Once the intoxication wore off, the pain would often return with renewed vengeance, sometimes accompanied by the throbbing headache of a hangover, adding misery upon misery. Other, even more dangerous substances occasionally found their way into the hands of those desperate for relief. Aconite, also known as wolf's bane, an extraordinarily poisonous plant, was sometimes used with extreme caution. Its application often external, due to its rapid absorption and lethal systemic effects. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, another highly toxic plant, was also known for its pain-relieving properties, but its use was equally perilous. The common thread among all these methods was the fundamental lack of understanding of pharmacology. There were no controlled trials, no scientific measurements, only generations of anecdotal evidence and observations of effect. Practitioners relied on crude estimates, often with disastrous consequences. The choice to administer such powerful substances was rarely made lightly. It was a testament to the excruciating nature of medieval tooth pain, a last resort before the patient or the practitioner moved to the ultimate terrifying solution. removal. These primitive forms of pain management often aim to prepare the patient for the ordeal to come, hoping to quiet their body and mind enough to allow the dreaded extraction to proceed. The limitations of these gentler methods, the poultices and the potions, became starkly clear when the pain escalated beyond endurance. For many, the throbbing agony of a truly diseased tooth simply would not yield to a compress of herbs or a whispered prayer. When the pain became a constant, unbearable companion, disrupting sleep, work, and peace, a more drastic solution was sought, and in the medieval mind, a solution was often synonymous with removal. This was the era when the primary cure for a persistent toothache, particularly one deeply rooted in decay, became the brutal act of extraction. You see, the medieval understanding of the body, and specifically of dental ailments, lacked the precision of modern science. The lingering belief in the tooth worm, a tiny unseen creature gnawing at the tooth's core, meant that the only way to truly eradicate the source of the suffering was to remove the worm, and with it, the tooth itself. If the worm lived inside the tooth, then the tooth had to go. This simple, albeit flawed logic drove the practice of extraction. It was not seen as a last resort, but often as the ultimate and most reliable intervention when all other attempts to soothe or charm the pain away had failed. The very concept of saving a tooth or filling a cavity to preserve it was largely absent from their medical repertoire. Once a tooth was compromised to the point of causing unrelenting pain, it was considered lost, a source of infection and suffering that needed to be excised from the body permanently. The decision to undergo such a procedure was not made lightly. Imagine the scene. A person, perhaps a farmer or a merchant, their face swollen, their jaw throbbing, having endured days, even weeks, of relentless pain. They would have tried every known remedy, from applying warm bread to their cheek to consuming powerful herbal concoctions that might have brought temporary oblivion. But when the pain returned, sharper and more insistent, the fear of the procedure itself began to be outweighed by the unbearable reality of their present suffering. The desperation was palpable. Life in the Middle Ages was hard, often short, and pain was a constant companion for many. Yet a toothache, with its localized, insistent throb, could incapacitate an individual more thoroughly than a broken bone or a fever. It robbed them of sleep, making them irritable and unable to focus. Eating became a torment, leading to weakness and malnourishment. The constant gnawing presence of pain could truly break a person's spirit, making them willing to accept almost any risk for the promise of relief. This shift towards extraction also reflects a pragmatic, if harsh, approach to medicine. While some practitioners might have specialized in more intricate procedures, tooth pulling was considered a relatively straightforward, if profoundly unpleasant task. It required strength, a firm grip, and a basic understanding of leverage, rather than deep anatomical knowledge or complex surgical skills. This made it accessible to a wider range of practitioners, not just the learned physicians, who often disdained such manual work as beneath their dignity, but also the more common, hands-on healers of the age. The village barber, already accustomed to handling sharp instruments for shaving and bloodletting, or even the local blacksmith, whose strong hands and familiarity with tongs and other tools made him seem a natural choice for such a forceful task, would often perform these extractions. These individuals, though lacking formal medical training, were often the only recourse for the vast majority of the population who could not afford or access a university-trained doctor. The fees for a barber surgeon were far more manageable, and their services were available in nearly every town and larger village. The very nature of the tools available and the lack of any effective anesthesia meant that the procedure was inherently violent. There was no gentle numbing of the gum, no precise incision. It was a battle between the patient's pain and the practitioner's brute force. The prospect of having a strong, often unsanitized tool inserted into your mouth to wrench a living part of your body from its socket was terrifying. The sound of the tooth cracking, the tearing of the gum, the sudden, intense rush of blood. These were the sensory details that accompanied such an event. It was a moment of profound agony, brief, perhaps, but seared into memory. You would often be held down, perhaps by family members or assistants, as the practitioner worked quickly, trying to minimize the ordeal. The air might be thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of blood. For the patient, the act of consenting to an extraction was a surrender to immense, immediate pain in the hope of future relief. They understood that the process itself would be excruciating, a concentrated burst of agony far beyond the chronic ache they had been enduring. But the promise was freedom from the relentless throb that had consumed their days and nights. This desperation, this willingness to face an acute terror for the sake of lasting peace, truly highlights the severity of medieval dental pain and the limited options available to those who suffered from it. The rise of extraction as the go-to solution was a grim testament to the lack of alternatives, a stark choice between continuous torment and a brief but horrifying moment of intense surgical violence. It was a gamble, a plunge into the unknown, but one that countless medieval individuals were forced to take, driven by the sheer, unyielding demand for relief. The memory of such an experience, for those who survived it, would undoubtedly linger far longer than the pain itself, a haunting echo of the powerlessness one felt in the face of such a necessary evil. The understanding that this was the only path to peace, even through such a brutal gateway, speaks volumes about the suffering endured by so many. The next step was to understand what exactly this process entailed and what tools were used to accomplish such a daunting task. The descriptions themselves might make you wince, but they are crucial to grasping the reality of medieval dental care, as the medieval world slowly understood that many pains were rooted in the very structure of the tooth. The most drastic solution, extraction, became increasingly common. When all other remedies failed, when the pain became utterly unbearable, or when an abscess swelled the jaw to a grotesque size, threatening to spread its poison throughout the body, the decision was made the offending tooth had to come out. This was not a procedure performed in a quiet, clinically sterile surgical room as we might imagine today. Far from it. Often, such a dramatic event took place in the open air of a bustling market square, where the clamor of merchants and the shouts of vendors mingled with the occasional cry of a patient. Or it might be in the dimly lit corner of a barber shop, a place already redolent with the smell of stale blood and cheap soap, with curious onlookers gathered, a testament to both the raw fear and morbid fascination the process evoked in the community. The practitioner, as we have already explored, was rarely, if ever, a formally trained physician with a deep understanding of human anatomy or germ theory. Instead, it was typically the local barber surgeon, whose primary duties involved shaving beards, performing bloodletting to balance the body's humors, and dressing minor wounds. His familiarity with sharp instruments and his strength of arm made him seem a logical, if terrifying, choice for such a task. Alternatively, the village blacksmith, with his powerful hands, his knowledge of metal, and his array of robust tools, was often deemed capable. His workshop, filled with the clang of hammer on anvil and the acrid smell of hot metal and coal smoke, could become an impromptu dental clinic. Sometimes a traveling charlatan, a self-proclaimed tooth drawer, would arrive in town, setting up a temporary booth adorned with grotesque displays of extracted teeth, attracting desperate souls with bold promises of instant relief and even bolder, more theatrical actions. These individuals operated without licenses, without oversight, and with only the very crudest understanding of the delicate structures they were about to violate. For the patient, there was no gentle invitation to a reclining chair. You would likely be seated on a simple, uncomfortable wooden stool, or perhaps even forced to lie on the hard ground, your head braced against a wall or a strong knee. Strong assistants, often family members or apprentices of the practitioner, would hold you down firmly, their hands gripping your shoulders and arms, restraining your inevitable struggles. The very air would be thick with anticipation and the metallic tang of fear. The concept of local anesthesia, of numbing only the specific area of pain, was a distant dream, centuries from realization. Any pain relief offered would have been rudimentary at best, and often dangerous. Perhaps a generous swig of strong, crude ale or raw spirits would be pressed into your hand, intended to dull your senses and induce a state of stupor. Sometimes a dose of opium, a potent narcotic derived from poppies, might be administered, or a concoction containing mandrake, a plant known for its hallucinogenic and sedative properties. A hot or cold poultice might be applied to your swollen cheek, offering fleeting, superficial comfort. These substances might dull the sharp edges of sensation or plunge you into a hazy semi-consciousness, but they could not eliminate the profound, immediate, and overwhelming agony of what was to come. The tools themselves were a sight to behold, and not in a comforting way. They were often crafted by the very same blacksmith who might later wield them, made from rough iron or rudimentary steel. They were unpolished, often encrusted with grime, and certainly unsterilized, having been used on countless previous patients without so much as a wipe. There was the infamous pelican, a formidable instrument named for its passing resemblance to the bird's beak. This tool was designed to grip a tooth and, using a fulcrum placed against the jaw, pry it from its socket with immense leverage. Its design was meant for brute force and extraction, not precision, and it often caused significant collateral damage to surrounding teeth, gums, and even the underlying jawbone. Then there were the various forms of crude forceps, far larger and more robust than any modern equivalent, sometimes resembling blacksmith's tongs. These were designed for raw, crushing power, to clamp down on the tooth and wrench it free. The dental key was another popular and particularly notorious instrument. It looked much like a large antique door key, but with a stout claw at the end. The claw would be hooked over the tooth, often digging into the gum, and the shaft of the key would be rotated with considerable force, literally twisting the tooth out of its socket. This method was incredibly destructive, almost guaranteed to fracture the jawbone, splinter adjacent teeth, or cause extensive tissue damage in the process. The practitioner, his face grim with concentration, would grasp the chosen instrument. You would feel his strong, calloused hands, the cold, hard metal press against your gum, the pressure building slowly, inexorably. There would be a moment of bracing, a deep breath taken by the practitioner, a silent prayer perhaps offered by you, and then, with a sudden, violent twist or a powerful wrenching pull, the tooth would be attacked. The sound was often described as a sickening crack or a tearing, ripping sound followed by a hot gush of blood. The patient's scream, if they had the breath or the consciousness for it, would be sharp and immediate, quickly fading into gasps of shock, pain, and exhaustion. The goal was always speed. The faster the tooth was out, the less prolonged the suffering, and the less chance the patient had to struggle excessively or faint completely. But this speed came at a terrible cost. The surrounding tissues were frequently torn and shredded, the bone beneath splintered, and the wound left ragged and open. Once the tooth was finally extracted, often displayed triumphantly by the practitioner as proof of his skill and the patient's liberation, the immediate concern was the gushing blood. There was no concept of sterile gauze, no understanding of how to properly clean and close the wound, let alone suturing. Instead, the common practice was to rinse the mouth vigorously with wine or vinegar, liquids believed to have cleansing or astringent properties, though they would sting terribly in the open wound. Or perhaps a simple, unwashed cloth would be pressed against the bleeding socket, offering little more than a temporary barrier. Sometimes, in particularly severe cases, a hot iron might even be applied to cauterize the wound, a truly agonizing procedure in itself, but one believed to stop the flow of blood and prevent further bad humors or tooth worms from entering the body. The patient, often in a state of semi-consciousness from the sheer shock, pain, and perhaps the crude sedatives, would then be left to recover as best they could. There was no instruction on aftercare, no warning about the dangers of infection, no advice on what to eat or avoid. The success of the procedure was simply measured by the successful removal of the offending tooth and the desperate hope that the excruciating pain which had driven you to such extremes would finally cease. The immediate relief, when it came, was often overshadowed by the profound trauma of the extraction itself, leaving the patient weak, disoriented, and often with new, different forms of pain. This brutal process, with its crude tools, its lack of understanding of anatomy or basic hygiene, and its reliance on brute force, made the supposed cure often far more terrifying than the disease it aimed to alleviate. It was a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death in a time when medical knowledge was rudimentary and the desperate measures people took simply to escape an unbearable toothache. The memory of the cold metal, the tearing sound, and the raw, throbbing emptiness left behind would linger long after the initial pain had subsided, a testament to the sheer bravery or perhaps profound desperation of those who endured such a terrifying ordeal. After the tooth was finally wrenched free, leaving a raw, gaping void in the gum, a new set of dangers immediately presented themselves. The relief, if any, was often fleeting, quickly replaced by a deeper, more insidious threat: infection. You must understand that in the medieval world, the concept of invisible germs causing disease was completely unknown. There was no understanding of antisepsis, no knowledge of how microscopic organisms could invade the body and wreak havoc. The instruments used, whether a blacksmith's tongs, sharpened and crudely fashioned for the task, or a barber's rusty pliers, taken straight from his everyday tools, were rarely, if ever, sterilized. They were simply wiped clean with a rag, or perhaps not even that, carrying with them the remnants of previous procedures, dust, dirt, and countless unseen contagions from the shop floor or the common streets. The hands of the practitioner, whether a barber surgeon with his blood-stained apron or a traveling charlatan making his rounds, were likewise unwashed, often calloused and grimy from other labor, from handling coins, or from touching various unsanitary surfaces. When these unsterile tools, often crudely made and poorly maintained, made contact with the delicate tissues of the mouth, tearing and crushing as they did, they introduced countless unseen threats directly into the exposed wound. The open wound left by the missing tooth was a perfect breeding ground for these unseen enemies. Within hours or at most a day, the area often began to swell dramatically. The gum would become puffy and red, the surrounding tissues inflamed, hot to the touch. The pain, which the extraction was meant to alleviate, would return, sometimes with an even greater intensity than the initial toothache, as pus began to form, creating immense pressure within the jaw itself. You might imagine the throbbing ache, constant and relentless, radiating through the side of the face, making it impossible to eat any solid food, to speak without discomfort, to sleep soundly, or even to think clearly. The jaw might stiffen, making it difficult to open the mouth wide, further complicating any attempt to clean the area or alleviate the pressure. A fever would often set in, the body's desperate yet often futile attempt to fight off the invading pathogens. The patient would grow weak, their skin hot and flushed, their breath often foul from the accumulating infection, a sickly, sweet scent of decay that permeated the air around them. This was not a temporary discomfort, it was a profound, debilitating illness. Such infections were not minor inconveniences. They were life-threatening conditions. Without any understanding of antibiotics, which would not be discovered for centuries, there was no effective way to combat the relentless spread of bacteria once it had taken hold. The infection, starting in the jaw, could spread rapidly throughout the face and neck, causing grotesque abscesses that would grow larger and more painful, sometimes bursting through the skin, leaving disfiguring scars and open weeping wounds. Imagine the constant discharge, the smell, the unceasing pain. More dangerously, the infection could enter the bloodstream, leading to a condition known as sepsis, or blood poisoning. This was a swift and brutal killer. The bacteria, now circulating throughout the body, would begin to attack vital organs. The patient's mind would cloud. They might become delirious. Their heart rate would quicken. Their breathing would become labored, and their organs would begin to shut down, one by one. death could follow within a matter of days or even hours, a horrifying end that transformed a simple dental problem into a terminal illness. A seemingly minor toothache, if left untreated, or ironically treated by these brutal, unhygienic methods, could easily become a death sentence, a grim lottery where survival was never guaranteed. The local dentist, whether the barber surgeon or the itinerant charlatan, could offer no further help once this critical stage was reached. Their knowledge was exhausted, their crude tools useless against an internal enemy. They might try to drain the pus from a visible abscess, a painful and often ineffective procedure that merely offered temporary relief, if any. Or they might simply advise prayer, the application of more poultices, or resignation to fate, watching helplessly as their patient wasted away. The family would gather, watching their loved one suffer through unimaginable agony, succumbing to a malady that today would be easily cured by a simple course of medication. The memory of the extraction, the terrible moment of the tooth being pulled, would be forever linked not with relief, but with the onset of a new, more terrifying ordeal, a descent into a feverish delirium that often ended in the quiet stillness of death. It was a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death in a world where medical knowledge was rudimentary and the risks associated with even the simplest procedures were profound. The very act meant to end suffering often initiated a chain of events that culminated in a far more tragic end, leaving behind not a healthy smile, but a profound and lasting sorrow. For those who did survive the immediate post-extraction period, chronic complications were still common. The jawbone itself could become infected, a condition known as osteomyelitis, leading to persistent pain, ongoing discharge, and even the eventual loss of sections of bone. The surrounding soft tissues could also develop chronic inflammation, causing lasting swelling, tenderness, and a general feeling of unwellness. Scarring was almost inevitable, both internally within the mouth and sometimes externally on the face if abscesses had burst. The loss of teeth, especially multiple teeth, also led to significant issues with chewing and digestion, impacting the overall health and nutrition of the individual. Imagine trying to eat the coarse, often poorly prepared food of the Middle Ages with a damaged jaw and missing teeth. The quality of life was severely diminished. The constant dull ache, the intermittent fevers, the disfigurement, and the difficulty in performing basic functions like eating or speaking served as a perpetual reminder of the brutal intervention. The air might carry the faint, sickening scent of putrefaction, a constant reminder of the unseen battle being waged within the body. The cold dread that accompanied a spreading infection was a silent companion to the physical agony, a pervasive fear that the illness could return at any moment. For those who survived, the experience left not just a gap in their smile, but a deep psychological scar, a lasting fear of the very procedures meant to offer relief. The ordeal of a medieval tooth extraction was, in many ways, only the beginning of the true struggle, a struggle against an invisible enemy that often claimed victory. The relief of the initial pain was a small price to pay, perhaps, but the subsequent suffering could often eclipse it entirely, proving that the cure could indeed be far scarier than the original ailment, a scar on the very fabric of their existence. Even amidst such brutal and often desperate measures, some rudimentary attempts at oral hygiene did exist in the medieval world, though far from what we now recognize. The concept of preventing tooth decay was barely understood, as the true causes of cavities and gum disease remained a mystery. Instead of bacteria, then utterly unknown, people attributed dental ailments to mythical tooth worms, or imbalances in the body's humors, believing a surplus of cold or dampness could cause teeth to rot. Yet, the desire to keep teeth clean, or at least to freshen breath, was present, driven by social etiquette and the simple discomfort of a foul mouth. You might find people using rough linen cloths, sometimes dampened with water or wine, to wipe their teeth after meals, attempting to dislodge food particles. Certain herbs, like mint, sage, or rosemary, were frequently chewed not just for their aromatic qualities, but also for their perceived cleansing and strengthening properties for the gums. Some used finely ground bone, cuttlefish bone, salt, or even charcoal as abrasive powders, rubbing them onto their teeth with their fingers or a cloth. While these practices offered a small measure of superficial cleanliness, perhaps removing some food debris and temporarily masking bad odors, they lacked the scientific understanding necessary to truly combat the underlying processes of decay and infection. The focus remained largely on symptomatic relief and extraction rather than true prevention, a pattern deeply ingrained in the medieval medical mindset, where immediate problems were addressed with crude solutions, and long-term health was often left to fate or divine intervention. The prevailing belief systems and limited scientific tools meant the fundamental causes of oral disease remained shrouded in mystery, ensuring dental pain was a near-universal experience throughout life. The journey from these fearful medieval practices to the relatively comfortable and effective dentistry of today was not a sudden leap, but a slow, gradual evolution spanning many centuries, punctuated by small incremental advancements. For a long time, the barber surgeon continued to be the primary figure for dental extractions, their expertise based on practical experience and inherited techniques rather than any formal medical education. Their skills, though often brutally effective for removal, remained rooted in tradition and superstition, lacking a systematic approach to treatment. The understanding of human anatomy and physiology slowly improved during the Renaissance, as scholars began to dissect bodies and observe the intricate workings of the human form. But it took even longer for this newfound knowledge to significantly impact the day-to-day practice of dental care. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the tentative emergence of dedicated dental practitioners, individuals who began to focus solely on the mouth, distinguishing themselves from the general barber surgeons. These early dentists were still often trained through informal apprenticeships, learning by doing, but their specialization marked a crucial step. Pierre Fauchard, a French surgeon often considered the father of modern dentistry, published his seminal work, The Surgeon Dentist, or Treatise on the Teeth, in 1728. This comprehensive book was truly revolutionary, systematically describing oral anatomy, various dental diseases, and, crucially, detailing methods for restorative work beyond just extraction, such as early forms of fillings using lead or tin, and even rudimentary dentures crafted from ivory or bone. He advocated for a more scientific and meticulous approach, emphasizing observation, detailed record-keeping, and systematic treatment, which was a radical departure from the haphazard methods of the past. This publication marked a significant turning point, beginning the transformation of dentistry from a rough craft performed by various tradesmen to a distinct, albeit still developing, medical profession. The tools of the trade also underwent a slow but vital evolution. The dreaded pelican and the dental key, which were essentially leverage devices designed to rip teeth from the jaw with immense, brutal force, often causing fractures and extensive damage to the surrounding bone and gums, slowly gave way to more refined forceps. These newer instruments, though still intimidating, allowed for a more controlled and less traumatic extraction, minimizing collateral damage and reducing the immediate pain and risk of complications. The understanding of pain management also progressed beyond crude opiates like laudanum, mandrake infusions, or copious amounts of alcohol, which often carried their own dangers of poisoning or addiction. The profound discovery of anesthesia in the mid-19th century, particularly the use of ether and then nitrous oxide, transformed dental procedures from agonizing, scream-inducing ordeals into bearable experiences, allowing patients to undergo